Hey guys, tonight we walk into the heat shimmer of ancient southern Mesopotamia, where mud brick walls glow faintly at dusk, reeds whisper at the river's edge, and small clay tablets wait in the dark, like pocket-sized arguments with time. Some parts of tonight's story are widely accepted history grounded in archaeology excavation and the patient work of translation. Some parts are interpretation where a damaged line or odd phrase might suggest more than one meaning, and some parts are calm what-if imagination, the kind that lingers at the edge of the firelight without pretending to be fact. Historians debate plenty here, and they should. The tablets may tell us about grain taxes, hymns and kings, but they also leave gaps wide enough for rumour to stroll through, wearing dramatic sandals. You probably would not survive this place very gracefully, by the way, unless you enjoy river mud, blazing sun, and the administrative thrill of being counted with livestock. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me your location and local time down in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in the low country between rivers, where the land is flat enough to make the horizon feel like a promise nobody signed. Southern Mesopotamia does not welcome you with mountains or forests or any of the dramatic scenery that modern documentaries love to linger on. It offers mud water, heat insects, and the stubborn miracle of crops rising where careful hands persuade them to. Most historians agree that this is where some of the earliest cities took shape, not all at once, not by magic, and certainly not because someone woke up one morning and decided civilization sounded fun. Archaeology suggests that settlements in this region grew slowly over generations, clustering around canals, storehouses, shrines, and the endless need to organise people before people wandered off and became difficult. That much is solid ground. You can almost feel it under your feet, though the ground itself is more like packed dust with opinions. Then come the tablets. They are small, often palm-sized, marked with wedges pressed into wet clay by reed styluses. At first glance, they seem humble, almost disappointingly practical. They record rations, deliveries, offerings, names, sheep, beer, barley, labour. If you were hoping to find a clay notebook that simply says, "Dear future reader," there was definitely a world before ours, and it ended mysteriously. You are going to be disappointed very quickly. The evidence we do have points to scribes who were usually busy with earthly matters. And earthly matters, it turns out, are mostly paperwork. Civilization is born, and almost immediately somebody invents inventory. Still, a careful reading might suggest that the plainest tablets belong to a people already deeply concerned with order, sequence, legitimacy, and survival. They count because counting protects. They list because listing stabilizes. They copy because memory fails, and when memory is expensive, when your world depends on canals not breaking and grain not vanishing. One interpretation is that this obsession with record keeping reflects not just bureaucracy, but anxiety, not panic, not cosmic dread, just that old human feeling that if you do not write things down, things fall apart. And what if that feeling is the first faint clue? Not proof, not confirmation? Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is a mood, not a conclusion. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. We will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You walk farther into the city, if city is even the right word for what you are picturing. It is not a skyline of glass and steel. It is a crowded geometry of mud brick houses, courtyards, ovens, storage jars, narrow lanes, and temple compounds rising above daily life like organised mountains. Smoke curls into the evening air. Donkeys complain with total confidence. Somewhere a potter turns clay. Somewhere a brewer watches foam. Somewhere a scribe sits cross-legged with a tablet on his lap, and the calm superiority of someone who can write your name down permanently. which, to be fair, is power. What's broadly accepted is that these early urban worlds depended on management. Water had to be channeled, labour had to be directed, surplus had to be stored. Temples and palaces became centres not only of worship and prestige, but of economic control. This is one reason historians take the tablets so seriously. They are not fantasy novels in disguise. They are direct artefacts of a society learning how to hold itself together. But historians still argue whether the earliest written traditions preserve faint memories older than the tablets themselves. That exact debate matters tonight. Writing does not appear at the beginning of human memory. It appears after uncounted generations of spoken stories, rituals, warnings, and inherited fears. So even when the written tablets are practical, they may belong to communities carrying much older mental furniture, flood fears, stories of ruined settlements, tales of kings before kings, half-remembered disasters retold beside ovens while the river rises outside. A more cautious explanation could be that later mystery hunters dramatically overread ordinary texts because ordinary texts are not dramatic enough for the internet. Fair point. A Bali account tablet is not exactly a thriller. Nobody leans in and whispers, "Pass me the epic spreadsheet." But there is another side to that. The ordinary and the mysterious are not always enemies. Sometimes the mystery is not in what we know, but in what we cannot confirm. A civilization that spends so much effort fixing order in clay may be doing so because disorder was never far away. And disorder in southern Mesopotamia was always nearby. Floods could nourish fields and wreck them. Canals could sustain life and fail disastrously. Salts could creep into the soil. Cities could rise, decline, rebuild, and be forgotten in layers. Archaeology suggests continuity in many places, but not simplicity. The ground of Sumer is a stack of human attempts. Houses over houses. Temples rebuilt atop older temples. Streets remade. Walls collapsed and replaced. The landscape itself teaches people that worlds end in installments. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, that may help explain why later Sumerian texts can feel haunted by beginnings and endings at once. Not because they secretly preserve a complete lost chronology of a vanished, advanced civilization. Most historians agree there is no good evidence for that stronger claim. A fringe idea proposes something grander, of course. It says the tablets hint at a first world destroyed before recorded history began, perhaps by flood, divine conflict, or some forgotten catastrophe. This theory is not widely accepted, but it persists because the fragments are tantalizing. A damaged phrase here, a king list there, a myth that sounds older than the version we have. People love a sealed door even when it opens into a storage room. You cannot entirely blame them. There is something strangely intimate about clay. Stone feels official, bronze feels heroic, gold feels expensive enough to cause family disputes, but clay feels close to the hand. Press a sign into wet earth, bake it by accident or intention, and suddenly your moment survives. The tablet becomes a stubborn survivor of fire, flood, and neglect. It waits in ruins until someone with a brush uncovers it and asks what it knew. The answer is often mundane, yet even the mundane has shadows. A ration list implies workers. Workers imply institutions. Institutions imply memory, and memory once formalized often reaches backward toward things it cannot fully explain. What if the story is pointing at something else, not a hidden super civilization with laser temples and excellent branding, more likely something quieter and honestly more human? Perhaps the sense of a first destroyed world is really the accumulation of many local endings. A drowned village, a failed canal system, a temple rebuilt after collapse, a dynasty remembered badly, a flood retold so often it becomes the flood. The evidence we do have points to a region where people lived with fragility every season. In such a place, the imagination does not need much encouragement. It takes broken walls and turns them into ancestors. It takes old mud beneath new foundations and calls it the age before this one. That possibility is not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but it gives you a useful way to hold the tablets in your mind tonight. Not as proof of one dramatic secret, but as clues from people who understood that order is temporary, memory is selective, and every world thinks it is the first one until it starts digging. So you stand now at the edge of Sumer, with river damp in the air and clay dust on your fingers, watching the last light fade on walls built by people who counted everything, because so much could be lost. The tablets do not shout, they murmur. They do not hand you a solved riddle. They hand you fragments, routines, names and rituals, then leave you to notice the silence around them. The silence is where the older questions live. What came before the records? What vanished before the scribes pressed reed into clay? And how much of what feels mysterious is not hidden truth, but ordinary human memory, worn smooth by time, until it gleams like myth. You keep walking deeper into the city, while somewhere in the dusk, a scribe lifts another wet tablet and presses order into mud as if the world might crack without it. The city grows around you by increments so practical they almost hide how strange the whole thing is. One wall added here, one canal widened there, one shrine enlarged because a god like a landlord apparently never feels the place is quite big enough. Most historians agree that the first Sumerian cities rise from mud, labour, water control, and the slow management of surplus. No orchestra swells as civilization arrives. No shining founder plants a banner and announces urban life. What's broadly accepted is quieter than that. Villages thicken into towns. Towns gather authority. Temples accumulate grain. Families become households. Households become neighbourhoods. Neighbourhoods lean together until suddenly you are standing in something large enough to need rules, records, and the sort of administrative patience that would make your modern inbox look almost merciful. Archaeology suggests that this transformation takes place over many generations, especially during the 4th millennium BCE, when southern Mesopotamia sees increasing settlement density, expanding irrigation, growing craft specialization, and the emergence of temple-centered institutions. The evidence we do have points to a society inventing scale. That may sound abstract until you feel the scale physically. There are more people, more carts, more jars, more reeds cut for roofs, more footsteps packing lanes into hard earth, more demands on the river, more reasons to remember who owes what to whom. Civilization, in one very honest sense, is what happens when everyone has too many neighbours and nobody trusts rain alone. You pass workers carrying baskets of clay on their heads, backs bent, with the kind of resignation that lasts longer than empires. Nearby, a team dredges a canal, while someone shouts instructions nobody enjoys hearing. Beyond them rises a temple platform, its edges squared and purposeful, a reminder that the sacred and the administrative are not separate lanes here. They share a building like two roommates who pretend not to judge each other while absolutely doing so. One interpretation is that the obsession with order in these early cities may reflect more than efficiency. A careful reading might suggest that people who build such dense systems are not simply ambitious. They may also be uneased. Water can fail, crops can fail, agreements can fail. A city is a machine for reducing uncertainty, but it is also proof that uncertainty has become serious enough to require management. If we treat that as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the city itself begins to look like a response to remembered instability. Historians still argue whether the rise of urban life in Sumer should be understood mainly as ecological adaptation, religious coordination, economic concentration, political competition, or some braided combination of all four. That debate matters because each explanation carries a different emotional shape. If cities emerge mostly from irrigation demands, then order grows from practical necessity. If temples drive the process, then order grows under sacred authority. If competition between settlements matters most, then order becomes a weapon, as much as a comfort. A more cautious explanation could be that all of these forces overlap because human beings rarely organise themselves for one elegant reason. They pile motives on top of each other like bricks, then act surprised when the wall becomes history. The streets remind you that urban life is not glamorous from the inside. Mud sticks to your sandals. Smoke from cooking fires hangs low in the evening. Goats insert themselves into serious situations with complete disregard for policy. Children weave through adults carrying jars. Dogs sleep where they probably should not. Somewhere barley is being measured with solemnity that borders on religious experience. Somewhere else beer is being poured, which is perhaps the more understandable ritual. Most historians agree that barley bread, beer and wool sit near the centre of Sumerian daily life, and you can feel that economy all around you. This world smells of damp clay, warm grain, sweat reeds and animal breath. It is less cradle of civilization and more warehouse district with theology, which honestly makes it easier to believe. And yet there is a mood beneath the labour. The city does not feel carefree, it feels necessary. What if every wall you see is built with the memory of water pressing against it? That is a cinematic thought, not a settled fact, but it fits the landscape. Southern Mesopotamia is generous only when carefully persuaded. The rivers nourish and threaten in the same breath. Canals create order while also demanding endless maintenance. A breach in one place can ripple through entire communities. In such a setting, building upward and outward is not just ambition, it may be reassurance made visible. One interpretation is that Sumerian urban planning reflects confidence. Another is that it reflects fear domesticated into routine, not panic, not apocalypse, just the steady awareness that without systems things slide back toward mud very quickly. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we cannot confirm. You cannot excavate emotion directly. Archaeologists recover walls, pottery ceilings, foundations, ovens and tablets. They do not recover the sigh a worker lets out when a canal bank collapses for the third time. They do not recover the private thought of a temple administrator staring at grain tallies like they personally insulted him. But traces of stress appear indirectly. Systems become complex because pressure exists. Record keeping expands because stakes are high. Authority centralizes because coordination matters. The city is a triumph, yes, but also a defensive act against disorder. A fringe idea proposes that the very first cities are copies of something older, a dim imitation of a world already lost before written history. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. Most historians agree that urbanism in Mesopotamia develops from local and regional processes we can partially trace through archaeology. Still, the fringe idea survives because cities themselves invite it. Stand before a temple terrace in fading light. Watch workers stream past, hear the mutter of prayers and market arguments, and it becomes easy to imagine that all this order is borrowed. That somewhere behind the known story there was an earlier lesson learned, badly remembered, imperfectly, then rebuilt in mud. To be clear, that's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The stronger supernatural or hidden civilization versions of the claim are not supported by mainstream evidence. But the weaker and more human version is harder to dismiss. Cities are often second drafts. People learn from prior failures, even when those failures are only local, seasonal, or half-remembered. A collapsed embankment, a ruined quarter, a drought, a flood a violent transfer of power, a migration from one settlement to another. None of that requires Atlantis in a reed hat. It only requires generations carrying lessons forward until those lessons harden into custom. You notice how much effort goes into boundaries. Courtyards enclosed, storehouses sealed, fields marked, labour assigned, offerings counted, gods located in temples, as if even heaven benefits from proper filing. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian institutions help organise not only production, but meaning. The temple is not just a religious centre, it is an anchor. It tells people where the cosmos connects to the city and where the city connects to survival. One interpretation is that such structures become emotionally powerful precisely because life is unstable enough to need symbolic certainty. And perhaps that is where the destroyed First World begins, not as one cataclysmic event recorded clearly and then hidden from us, but as a repeated sensation. The feeling that the ground beneath life is never final. The sense that order must be remade every day. A city of mudbrick knows this better than a city of stone. Rain can soften what hands have raised. Water can undo geometry with almost comedic speed. Time does not attack dramatically here. It slumps, cracks, erodes and returns everything toward earth. The city rises anyway. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. But the mood remains useful. You walk under reed matting that filters the light, past a courtyard where someone needs clay for bricks, and you begin to understand that the earliest cities may not simply announce human confidence. They may also record human caution. They are not only monuments to progress, they are shelters against forgetting what chaos feels like. By nightfall, lamps flicker behind plastered walls, temple shadows lengthen, and the hum of the city softens without disappearing. Even in darkness, somebody is still measuring, carrying, sweeping, guarding, praying. The machine of order never fully sleeps. Maybe that is the true old memory preserved here. Not a secret account of one vanished superworld, but the persistent knowledge that worlds can fray. So people build. They count. They repair. They name. They stack one day carefully on top of another and hope the tower holds. And over it all, the city keeps rising from mud, as though trying to prove gently and repeatedly that this time it will last. Night settles lightly over the city, and with it comes the kind of stillness that never quite becomes silence. A dog barks once and then gives up. Somewhere a baby protests the unfairness of being born into an age before air conditioning. A lamp guttering behind a wall throws moving shadows over packed earth, and in the dimness you begin to hear names, not spoken aloud just now, but preserved in lists copied by scribes, arranged into sequences that were meant to make the past look orderly. This is where the kings arrive. Most historians agree that the Sumerian king list is one of the most intriguing texts from ancient Mesopotamia, not because it gives us a simple timeline, but because it does not. What's broadly accepted is that the text combines dynasties, cities and reign lengths into a long account of rule passing from place to place. Some rulers and later dynasties align at least in part with evidence from inscriptions and archaeology. Others drift deep into legendary territory. The earliest kings are said to reign for impossibly long spans, measured not in plausible decades, but in vast numbers that stroll casually past common sense, as if common sense forgot its invitation. And that is where the mood changes. A careful reading might suggest that the king list is doing more than recording succession. It is shaping memory. It is telling you who mattered where power belonged, and how authority survived disruption. One interpretation is that the absurdly long reigns in the earliest portions should not be read literally at all. They may be symbolic, ideological, or mythic. They may compress old traditions. They may exaggerate distance from the present. They may say, in their own formal way, things were different back then, more remote, more charged, less measurable by the rhythms you know now. Historians still argue whether the king lists should be treated primarily as political propaganda, a literary ordering of old traditions, a memory device, or some blend of all three. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is exactly why it keeps pulling people back. The evidence we do have points to a document composed and recopied in historical contexts where legitimacy mattered. Rulers had every reason to place themselves inside a grand line of authority. If you can persuade people that kingship has always flowed through the proper cities and that you are its current steward, you look less like a temporary winner and more like destiny wearing a crown. Which is useful, especially if your neighbours also have crowns and very strong opinions. Still, those earliest names and reigns do something strange to the imagination. Before the flood, the text says in later versions, before a break, before kingship shifted, before the world of ordinary duration. The phrase does not automatically mean a lost advanced civilization, and most historians agree it should not be stretched that far. But it does preserve a split in time. There is the age before and the age after. That much matters. What if the list is less a timeline and more an echo? That is not a conclusion. It is a way of listening. You picture a scribe leaning over damp clay, copying names from an older tablet, perhaps itself copied from another. The signs are careful, formal, deliberate. Writing creates the illusion that memory is stable, but memory has always been edited. Some names remain because institutions preserve them. Others vanish because the building burned, the tablet broke, the school closed, or the next dynasty preferred not to remember them. The king list is not a neutral shelf where the past politely arranges itself. It is a curated hallway. Lamps illuminate some doors and leave others closed. A fringe idea proposes that the impossibly long reigns preserve literal memories of beings or rulers from a first world destroyed before recorded history began. This theory is not widely accepted, but it has obvious dramatic appeal. The numbers are huge, the setting feels ancient, even by ancient standards. The break marked by flood or transition is tantalizing. If you already want the tablets to whisper about a vanished world here, they are practically clearing their throat. But a more cautious explanation could be that ancient people, like modern people, use scale symbolically. Long reigns can signal sacred distance, grandeur, antiquity, and authority. They can make early kings feel like foundational figures beyond ordinary human proportion. The same instinct appears in many traditions. Founders grow taller in memory, ancestors gain polish, origins expand. The first age always seems larger, brighter, stranger, and somehow more exhausting than the present. History becomes myth, not because everyone is lying, but because memory loves atmosphere. An atmosphere the king list has in abundance. It gives you cities that hold kingship as though kingship were a sacred object being carried from one place to another. Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sipar, Shurapak. The names move with deliberate rhythm, and each sounds less like a GPS pin and more like a room in a dream. Archaeology suggests that several of these places were indeed important ancient centres, though not always in the exact sequence or terms later tradition presents. The evidence we do have points to real places layered with literary meaning. That alone is enough to make the text shimmer. One interpretation is that the early part of the list preserves cultural memory of a time before political order stabilised into patterns later scribes recognised. Not a single secret empire, not a hidden continent, but a haze of old settlements, local rulers, oral traditions and disaster stories later organised into a ceremonial prehistory, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. Then the first world may not mean another planet of existence. It may mean the remembered age before history was pinned down by administrative writing. A world before proper records, before the neatness of named years and measured tribute, before scribes could trap the present in clay and force it to behave. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we cannot confirm is how much older memory seeps beneath the text. Oral tradition can travel far, but not cleanly. Stories fold time. They combine rulers. They magnify floods. They attach cosmic language to local events. They forget dates and preserve feelings. If a city was destroyed, rebuilt, and remembered generations later, the event may survive less as a report than as a mood. If kingship really did shift after social collapse or regional disruption, later texts might preserve that fact without preserving its scale accurately. The king list could then become a polished surface over rough historical stone. The night air cools slightly. From the river comes a faint wet smell mixed with lamp smoke and reed dust. You can imagine students in a scribal house memorizing old lines, not because they fully understand them, but because tradition says they matter. That is another widely accepted part of this world. Scribes copied old texts in educational settings. Preservation often depends less on universal comprehension than on institutional habit. A text survives because someone is made to copy it under supervision while trying not to smudge the signs. Civilization once again owes a lot to bored students. What's broadly accepted is that the king list reflects historical memory shaped into ideological form. One interpretation is that it also reveals a human discomfort with beginnings. People prefer origins that feel ordered. They want the first age arranged, named, ranked and handed down. Yet the earliest part of the list resists that neatness with giant numbers and dreamlike distance. It is as if the text itself cannot fully decide whether the oldest past belongs to history or to myth. That hesitation is where tonight's title quietly lives. Not in a flat claim that the tablets reveal in a modern, sensational sense a fully documented world destroyed before recorded history began. The tablets do not hand over anything so tidy. Let me rephrase that more carefully. They raise the possibility that ancient Mesopotamians imagined deep time in layers, with a meaningful divide between their recorded order and a more mysterious before. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. Still, as you stand beneath a darkening sky and recite those old city names in your head, you feel why people keep returning to them. Not because they solve the riddle, but because they preserve the outline of one. There was a before. It was different. It was larger in memory than in proof. And whatever happened between that age and this one, later scribes felt compelled to bridge the gap with names, numbers, and the formal dignity of clay. So the kings pass before you like distant lanterns in fog, too bright to ignore, too blurred to trust completely, and the list keeps stretching backward toward a world that feels less recorded than remembered. Those names linger in your mind long after the lamps burn low, and by dawn the city feels damp around the edges, as if the river has breathed on it during the night. You wake, if waking is the word for slowly reassembling yourself on a reed mat, while somebody nearby starts working far too early to the sound of water being lifted, poured, redirected, argued with. In Sumer, water is never just scenery. Most historians agree that southern Mesopotamia lives by its rivers, canals, levees and seasonal flood patterns. Archaeology suggests that irrigation makes large settlements possible, but it also creates permanent vulnerability. The same water that feeds barley can also erase boundaries, soften walls, drown fields, and turn every human plan back into mud with almost insulting efficiency. You step outside into pale morning light and immediately understand that the city is not separate from water. It is a negotiation with it. Narrow channels glint beyond walls. Workers tramp along embankments. Reed beds tremble in the breeze. The earth itself looks only half convinced it wants to stay solid. What's broadly accepted is that life here depends on collective labour to manage water flow, maintain canals and protect cultivated land. That practical reality matters more than any dramatic mystery, because it shapes how people think, pray, organise and remember. If your food supply depends on keeping the river mostly cooperative, then the river becomes both parent and threat. It gives and takes with the emotional consistency of a cat. One interpretation is that the emotional force of later flood stories may come from this daily intimacy with danger. A careful reading might suggest that the great Mesopotamian flood traditions, which appear in several later texts, do not emerge from nowhere. They grow from a landscape where destructive water is plausible, recurring, and unforgettable. The evidence we do have points to floods as a real and serious feature of life, though historians still argue whether any specific literary flood story reflects one major historical event. Many events layered together, or mostly symbolic storytelling built from collective experience. That debate is worth holding gently in your hands, because this is where modern imagination loves to sprint ahead in very dramatic sandals. A popular rumour claims that the flood traditions preserve a crystal clear memory of a single first world destroyed before recorded history began, maybe globally, maybe almost cosmically, depending on how excited the narrator is. This theory is not widely accepted in that stronger form. Most historians agree the evidence does not support a straightforward reading of Sumerian or later Mesopotamian flood narratives as documentary reports of a planet-wide catastrophe. To be clear, this is debated at the edges, but mainstream scholarship stays cautious. Still, caution does not make the stories less haunting. You imagine standing on a levee while dark water rises beyond what feels reasonable. Not a theatrical wall of doom from a disaster movie, but a slow, relentless swelling that turns confidence into arithmetic. How high, how fast, how much grain can be moved, how many animals can be untethered, which wall gives first, which family reaches the roof, which canal becomes a breach. The river does not need to become supernatural to terrify you. It only needs to arrive one handspan higher than expected. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the first world, destroyed before recorded history began, is not one lost civilization in the modern fantasy sense, but the repeated destruction of small human worlds, each complete to the people inside it? A house is a world. A harvest is a world. A neighbourhood is a world. A shrine is a world. A familiar canal route is a world. When floodwater tears through any of these, the loss is total from ground level. Even if later archaeology files it under regional hydrological variation, which is accurate but not exactly soothing. Historians still argue whether particular flood deposits found at some Mesopotamian sites can be linked to the literary flood traditions. Archaeology has revealed evidence of flood layers in certain places, but not in a neat universal pattern that would let you draw one giant circle around the entire region and declare the case solved. A more cautious explanation could be that different communities experienced major floods at different times, remembered them intensely, and contributed fragments to a shared flood imagination that later texts shaped into grand narrative. This raises the possibility that the literary flood is not false but composite, memory braided from many wet disasters. And braided memory can feel older than any one event. That matters, because writing in Mesopotamia appears after long ages of oral transmission. The great flood stories reach us in texts copied centuries after the earliest urban developments they may dimly echo. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we cannot confirm. We cannot stand beside the first teller and ask politely but firmly how literal he means this to be. We cannot know how many previous floods are hiding behind one story. We cannot know how much sacred drama has fused with practical memory. We only know that water and ruin belong together in this landscape, and that later tradition treats that pairing with enormous seriousness. You keep walking toward the outer edges of cultivated land, where irrigated order loosens into marsh and glare. Birds lift from reeds in sudden bursts. Mud sucks at your sandals with unfriendly affection. Somewhere a worker curses softly at a clogged channel, proving that some experiences are timeless. Most historians agree that managing this environment requires coordination on a scale larger than one household. That is one reason authorities matter so much here. Water management is social management. A canal system is a map of cooperation, hierarchy, and obligation. If that system fails, it is not only fields that suffer, trust suffers too. One interpretation is that flood myths may encode social collapse as much as natural disaster. A careful reading might suggest that when texts describe overwhelming destruction, they may also be speaking about the breakdown of ordered relationships, kingship interrupted, temples damaged, labour scattered, lists lost, boundaries erased. In a place where civilization depends on keeping channels open and duties clear, chaos is both hydraulic and political. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the flood becomes more than water. It becomes the image of all systems failing at once. The city behind you now seems fragile in a new way. Mudbrick walls are miracles, yes, but they are soft miracles. They endure through maintenance, not invincibility. The evidence we do have points to frequent rebuilding in ancient Mesopotamian settlements, which should not surprise anyone who has ever watched rain do whatever it wants to a dirt path. Yet rebuilding leaves a mental mark. If generation after generation must restore patch and raise structures after damage, then the past starts to feel layered with endings. A temple platform rises over older ruins. A courtyard covers an earlier floor. A family cooks above the broken line of somebody else's wall. Worlds end, and then people build dinner on top of them. A fringe idea proposes that these buried layers are traces of a far older, advanced world, mostly lost to catastrophe. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. But the thinner version, the more human version, needs no exotic machinery. It only requires the ordinary cruelty of floodplain life. Let me rephrase that more carefully. You do not need a vanished super-civilization to explain why Mesopotamian memory feels preoccupied with destruction. You need rivers, mudbrick, long oral tradition, and communities forced to remember that land can betray them politely and without warning. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. But as morning brightens and the water flashes in every direction, you feel why later storytellers give flood such enormous symbolic weight. It is not merely weather, it is the return of formlessness, the undoing of named things, the reason people count, build, pray and copy, the quiet monster in the background of civilized life, never fully asleep. So when later texts speak of a world before and a world after, the language may be grand, but the emotional truth is intimately local. Someone somewhere watched their known world go under. Then they climbed down from whatever remained, pressed fresh clay in their hands, and started naming things again. By the time the sun climbs higher, the city's edges begin to shimmer, and the temple platform ahead of you looks less like architecture and more like an idea somebody forced into shape with 10,000 baskets of mud. It rises above the low roofs with a confidence the rest of the city only pretends to have. Most historians agree that temple complexes stand at the centre of Sumerian civic and religious life, and that later Mesopotamian ziggurats developed from earlier monumental platforms and sacred precincts. What's broadly accepted is that these elevated structures are not mystical machines in the modern fantasy sense. They are places of worship, storage, administration, identity, and visibility. They gather heaven authority and grain into one imposing silhouette, which is honestly an efficient use of real estate. You begin the climb. The steps are wide, sun-warmed, and slightly uneven, in the way all important old things seem to be, as if dignity includes a small tripping hazard. Below you the city spreads in muted browns and pale plaster, threaded by lanes and the distant shine of water. Above you the upper shrine waits in stillness, its plastered surfaces catching light. The higher you go, the more everything below seems arranged, almost manageable. One interpretation is that this physical experience matters. Height changes emotion. A careful reading might suggest that temple elevation does not only honour the gods, it also lets human beings feel, for a few minutes at least, that disorder has been placed beneath them. Archaeology suggests that these temple platforms and later ziggurats are rebuilt repeatedly over time, often enlarged, repaired and layered atop older sacred foundations. That detail deserves your attention. Sacred architecture in Mesopotamia is rarely one clean event. It is accumulation, one platform over another, one temple replacing a predecessor, one generation lifting its holy space above the remains of earlier devotion. The evidence we do have points to continuity, but also to fragility. Sacred height is not achieved once, it is maintained against weather erosion, politics, and time. Even the road toward the gods needs patching. Historians still argue whether the symbolic meaning of these elevated structures is primarily cosmological, political ritual, or all three at once. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient builders did not separate those categories neatly in the first place. In Sumer, the temple is not just where religion happens while economics waits politely outside. The temple receives offerings, organises labour, legitimizes authority, stores wealth, and gives the city a visible centre. To stand on its height is to stand inside a claim about how the world should be arranged. And that claim may tell you something about fear. What if climbing upward is not only about reaching the divine, but about escaping memory of what lies below? That is a cinematic thought, not a settled conclusion, but it suits the place. In a floodplain world, where water, mud and collapse are familiar companions, elevation carries practical and emotional weight. Most historians agree that sacred high places in Mesopotamia are linked to divine presence and civic prestige, but one interpretation is that they may also express longing for stable ground. If daily life takes place among walls that crack, lanes that flood, and foundations that shift, then a raised temple becomes more than a ritual site. It becomes a model of permanence, or at least the nearest available imitation. A fringe idea proposes that ziggurats preserve memory of contact with beings from a previous world, or functioned as some kind of ancient interface between realms. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence is thin to non-existent in mainstream terms. Still, such ideas persist because the structures themselves are theatrical. Their height is symbolic. Their geometry is commanding. Their stairways look like invitations to overinterpret. People see a monumental staircase and immediately want it to lead to secrets. Human beings, bless them, have never met a dramatic staircase they did not try to mythologize. But the more grounded explanation is already interesting enough. What's broadly accepted is that sacred buildings condense the values of the society that builds them. If Sumerian cities invest so much labour into raising temples above ordinary ground, then the act reflects what they need from the world: order, mediation, visibility, divine favour, a centre that does not drift. One interpretation is that the architecture also reveals a psychological need to rise above the unstable plane, to create something that appears firmer than the landscape that sustains it. The higher shrine is quiet, now attended perhaps by a priest, a servant, or the faint smell of burnt offering lingering in the air. From here, the city feels patterned, almost as if all the mess below could be read like a tablet. Courtyards, rooflines, streets, workshops, herd pens, the canal beyond, the fields farther still. It is tempting to imagine that from this height the priests saw not just the city they had, but the city they hoped to hold together. The temple turns geography into moral geometry. High is pure, centre is sacred, below is labour, beyond is uncertainty. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we cannot confirm. We know these structures mattered profoundly. We know they were rebuilt over long spans. We know they linked the civic and the divine. What we cannot confirm is how many older feelings they silently carried. Did each rebuilding preserve memories of prior destruction? Did the raised platform soothe anxieties people never wrote plainly? Did the repeated elevation of sacred space reflect practical ritual, logic alone, or also a cultural memory that life at ground level could be undone? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then these temple heights begin to look like a response to a broken world, though not necessarily a single broken world. Let me rephrase that more carefully. They may reflect repeated encounters with instability layered over generations, until elevation itself becomes meaningful. A city that rebuilds its sacred centre above earlier ruins is performing memory through architecture. The first world need not be one lost civilization. It may be every earlier version of the city now buried underneath the Holy One. That idea fits what archaeology often reveals in Mesopotamia: deep occupational layers, sacred continuity on ancient spots, structures growing upward from their own ruins. Most historians agree that this kind of rebuilding is common, especially in long-lived settlements. What's broadly accepted is not mystery but persistence. Yet persistence has a ghostly side. Every new temple quietly stands over the remains of old prayers. Every fresh plastered wall seals earlier walls into darkness. Every sacred ascent is also a small act of burial. You descend slowly, heat gathering around the steps, and the city below reclaims its noise. A pot shatters somewhere with the tragic dignity of a tiny domestic apocalypse. A donkey voices its objections to existence. A boy runs by carrying reeds, followed by a man who looks like patience left his body years ago. Down here again, the temple height already feels dreamlike. But its message lingers. Rise above. Keep order. Centre the sacred. Rebuild when needed. Pretend permanence is possible long enough for the next generation to inherit the job. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. But as the platform glows behind you in the noon light, it becomes hard not to feel that Sumerian sacred architecture is answering a question, even when it does not name it. How do you live in a place that keeps reminding you the ground is temporary? One answer is practical. You repair canals, count grain, and assign labour. Another answer is symbolic. You build upward. You give the gods a house above the reach of ordinary chaos. You make height itself part of the cure. So the temple remains there over the city, not as proof of hidden technology or lost alien memory, but as something more revealing in its own quiet way. A raised answer to a lowland fear. A staircase built from mud and hope. A sacred insistence that even on a plane of flood and ruin, human beings can still imagine a place where the world holds. As you move back down into the streets, the temple still hovering behind your shoulder, like a thought that refuses to leave. The world becomes louder again. Potters tap wet clay into shape. A woman shakes grain from a basket with practiced rhythm. Somewhere a reed flute sends a thin note into the midday heat, and for a moment the city seems almost peaceful, until you remember that Sumerian myths are full of gods who behave less like serene cosmic principles and more like powerful relatives at a very tense family gathering. Most historians agree that Sumerian religious texts describe divine beings tied to creation, kingship, fertility storms, wisdom, and the fragile order of the world. What's broadly accepted is that these myths are symbolic ritual and literary, not eyewitness reports from a lost supernatural newsroom. Still, a careful reading might suggest that the gods often sound uncannily like rulers, labour managers, survivors, and anxious planners. That detail matters more than it first appears. You hear stories of an Enlil Enki Inanna Ninhursag, and others drifting through hymns, temple recitations, and inherited tradition. Their names carry authority, but their actions often feel surprisingly earthly. They assign duties, they establish boundaries, they quarrel, they punish, they rescue, they lament destruction, they worry about noise disruption or disorder in ways that feel frankly a little administrative. One interpretation is that this is simply how ancient societies imagined the divine by projecting their own structures upward into heaven. A more cautious explanation could be that myths provide a sacred language for human problems people cannot otherwise frame at full scale. Archaeology suggests that religion in Sumer is inseparable from civic life, and the evidence we do have points to temples' offerings and divine patronage as central to how cities understood themselves. That means myths are never just entertainment. They are maps of how reality should work. But maps can also preserve old anxieties. Historians still argue whether the conflict and labour themes in early Mesopotamian myth reflect mostly ritual theology, social organisation, or dim cultural memory of environmental and political stress. There is no full consensus, which is probably appropriate for stories involving gods with enough family tension to fill several respectable dinner disasters. If you listen closely, some myths do not sound like tales of a perfect world. They sound like stories told after difficulty. The gods create, but they also react. They set things in order because disorder is imaginable. They punish because boundaries are fragile. They divide roles because chaos is always waiting in the hallway, pretending it just needs to grab one quick thing. What's broadly accepted is that creation stories in Mesopotamia often link human existence to labour, maintenance and service. That is not exactly the glossy brochure version of cosmic purpose, but it is honest. Human beings exist inside a worked world. One interpretation is that the gods may sometimes speak like rulers coping with aftermath, not because the myths literally describe surviving a destroyed prehistoric civilization, but because the language of rebuilding, assigning work and restoring balance fits societies familiar with disruption. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then divine drama may preserve the emotional shape of human recovery. A world breaks, order must be remade, roles must be assigned. Ritual becomes the script for surviving uncertainty. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the gods in these texts are not hiding an alien secret or a coded technological history, but a more human truth that when people live through repeated instability, they imagine even heaven as a place that must constantly manage the consequences? That is not as flashy as certain fringe documentaries would like, but it is more revealing. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths are deeply embedded in the political and environmental realities of the societies that told them. One interpretation is that divine conflict mirrors earthly conflict because that is the material available to the imagination. Sacred language grows from real pressure. A fringe idea proposes that the gods of Sumer were actually survivors or rulers from a lost first world, remembered later as divine beings after their true nature was forgotten. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. It persists because the myths contain hierarchy, specialized knowledge, strange powers, and catastrophic episodes which make them easy to dramatize. But let me rephrase that more carefully. The stronger claim is not supported by mainstream scholarship. The weaker claim that myths can preserve refracted memories of real stress, real authority, and real collapse is far more plausible. Take the recurring concern with order itself. The evidence we do have points to a society where irrigation, labour organisation, temple economy, and political legitimacy all depend on systems holding together. In such a world, stories about gods establishing boundaries are not abstract. They resonate. The divine becomes a larger version of what humans desperately need to believe, that the universe, however fragile, can be structured, that someone somewhere has a plan for the floodplain. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot know exactly how an early listener heard a particular myth on a specific evening in a specific courtyard. Did they hear cosmic truth, moral instruction, political reassurance, a faint echo of older disaster stories? Probably some combination. Human beings are rarely tidy consumers of meaning. They bring grief, memory, fear and routine into every sacred story they hear. A temple hymn is never only theology. It is also weather taxes, family history, and the fact that your roof leaked last spring. You pause in the shade of a wall while two workers carry a heavy jar past you, with the facial expressions of men who would gladly trade philosophy for fewer responsibilities. It is a useful reminder that myths are told among ordinary burdens. Most historians agree that Sumerian literature arises from institutions staffed by very earthly people: priests, scribes, administrators, labourers, and rulers all inhabit the same broad system. So when the gods in the stories sound like managers of a difficult world, that may be because their worshippers know exactly what difficult worlds feel like. One interpretation is that the divine complaints and corrections in myth encode a deep suspicion that the world does not naturally stay ordered. It must be renewed through ritual labour, memory, and obedience. That in turn makes the idea of a destroyed first world emotionally believable, even if not historically demonstrable in the dramatic way modern mystery culture prefers. The first world becomes a sacred background assumption. Things can fall apart. They may already have fallen apart once. The present order exists because someone or something held the fragments together. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but it helps explain why Mesopotamian mythology feels so different from stories of effortless paradise. These are not myths of permanent ease. They are myths of work, tension, maintenance, conflict, and restoration. Even creation arrives with assignments. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. Still, as the afternoon light shifts across plaster and brick, you can sense the emotional logic behind these divine stories. The gods do not float above Sumer in abstract perfection. They lean into the same questions everyone else does. How do you secure order? How do you endure disruption? How do you name a world that always seems close to slipping? So the myths murmur around you not as proof that a vanished world has been decoded, but as something subtler and in its own sleepy way more haunting. Sacred stories that may carry the posture of survivors. Not survivors of one proven global catastrophe perhaps, but survivors of flood rebuild fear and the long human habit of turning hard memory into gods. By late afternoon, the heat turns softer though, not kinder, and the city seems to exhale around you. Dust settles onto ledges. Reeds click together in the breeze. Somewhere close by, someone is grinding grain with the resigned rhythm of a person who has accepted that civilization runs on repetitive shoulder pain. You drift toward an older quarter, toward deeper ground, toward a place later generations will remember with unusual reverence. Eridu. Most historians agree that Eridu is among the oldest known urban or proto-urban centres in southern Mesopotamia, and archaeology suggests that its long sequence of occupation reaches deep into the Ubaid period, well before the full flowering of later Sumerian city life. What's broadly accepted is that Eridu matters enormously in Mesopotamian cultural memory. Later tradition associates it with antiquity, sacred beginnings, and the god Enki, lord of wisdom, fresh water, and clever solutions, which already sounds like exactly the kind of deity you would want in a landscape that keeps trying to become soup. You approach not one neat city frozen in time, but a layered sacred place built and rebuilt over centuries. The evidence we do have points to repeated temple construction on the site, with later structures rising above earlier ones in a sequence that feels almost ceremonial in its persistence. Archaeology does not present Eridu as a fantasy metropolis, lost beneath the sands, with intact crystal archives and dramatic background music. It presents a real settlement, a very old one, shaped by development, rebuilding, ritual, and time. And yet the atmosphere around its memory is unmistakably special. One interpretation is that Eridu's prestige in later texts may reflect more than simple age. A careful reading might suggest that it becomes a symbolic shoreline of beginnings, a place where the remembered past seems to gather itself before flowing into more familiar history. Historians still argue whether Eridu's status in literary tradition reflects actual political primacy in the earliest periods, or a later cultural choice to treat it as especially ancient and foundational. There's no full consensus which makes sense. The oldest places are rarely remembered with neat objectivity. They accumulate meaning the way mudbrick accumulates salt and weather. As you move through the imagined Eridu of this hour, it feels lower, quieter, more elemental than the busier cities behind you. Water lies nearby in channels or marshy edges. The temple precinct rises through successive layers like a patient thought. Birds move over wet ground. The air smells faintly mineral reed sweet and old. What if this is why Eridu stays in the cultural imagination, not only because it is ancient, but because it feels like a threshold, a place where land, water, settlement and sacred order first learned how to speak to one another? That is a mood, not a verdict. A fringe idea proposes that Eridu preserves memory of an even earlier world, perhaps a settlement founded after a prehistoric catastrophe, or built on the edge of a civilization lost before writing. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. Most historians agree that Eridu's importance can be explained through archaeology, regional development, and later literary prestige without invoking a vanished super-civilization. But if we treat the weaker version as a possibility rather than a conclusion, something gentler emerges. Perhaps Eridu felt old even to the ancients. Perhaps later people looked at its deep layers, its sacred continuity, and its association with wisdom and beginnings, and sensed that they were standing near the edge of memory itself. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know Eridu was ancient. We know it was ritually important. We know later tradition treated it as a place of origins. What we cannot confirm is how deeply that feeling of origin reached into collective memory. Did people imagine Eridu as the first stable point after chaos, as a sacred anchor after flood, as the remnant of an age more ancient than the scribes could fully narrate? Or was it simply a revered old centre that later writers polished into mythic prominence, because every civilization likes to point somewhere and say more or less it began over there? Which, to be fair, is a very human thing to do. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian literature often gives certain cities symbolic roles beyond their immediate political history. Cities become characters. They stand for order, kingship, wisdom, or divine favour. One interpretation is that Eridu, with its antiquity and sacred associations, becomes the ideal stage on which to place memories of beginnings that are otherwise too diffuse to locate. If oral traditions preserve dim awareness of early settlement phases, marshland adaptation, flood threat, or cycles of rebuilding, later texts may have concentrated that vague ancestral feeling into one deeply resonant name: Eridu. It lands in the mind like a stone dropped into still water. Archaeology suggests that the site's long occupational history includes multiple building phases, especially in sacred architecture, and that sequence itself can shape imagination. A city that keeps building its holy centre atop older foundations begins to look like a place with roots descending beyond easy sight. You do not have to invent hidden machines or forbidden archives to feel the effect. Stand before a sacred mound with deep stratigraphy. Hear that it has been holy for longer than living memory, and your mind starts to supply extra depth on its own. Human beings are incurable romantics around old foundations. A more cautious explanation could be that Eridu's aura comes from continuity rather than catastrophe. That may sound less exciting, but it is not less profound. Continuity can feel almost supernatural when it lasts through centuries of change. The survival of a sacred place through rebuilding, political shifts, and environmental pressure may itself inspire stories of beginning and return. In that sense, Eridu would not be the remnant of a destroyed first world. It would be the thread that seems to pass through many worlds without snapping. And yet, the possibility of older loss is hard to shake entirely, not because the evidence compels it in a direct way, but because the landscape encourages it. Southern Mesopotamia is a place of sediment, water, movement, ruin, and rebuilding. The evidence we do have points to a world where earlier human traces are often buried, softened, repurposed, or simply forgotten beneath later occupation. If a place like Eridu stood across many phases of human adjustment to that environment, then later reverence may preserve not detailed historical knowledge, but the emotional sense that this ground has seen more than can now be told. Historians still argue whether the oldest sacred centres in Mesopotamia were remembered through fairly stable traditions or constantly reimagined by later communities. That debate matters because it shapes how you hear the silence around Eridu. Is it silence after forgetting, or silence created by too much remembering polished until only the sacred outline remains? One interpretation is that myth tends to simplify what archaeology complicates. Another is that myth keeps the feeling of complexity alive, but in dream form. It says this place matters because it always mattered, and then it leaves you to wonder what happened in the years no one could write down. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. But Eridu has a way of inviting exactly this kind of careful wondering. Not the loud certainty of sensational claims, but the quieter question of whether the earliest remembered city might already have felt like a second attempt. What if its sanctity comes partly from being imagined as stable ground after instability? What if the wisdom of Enki belongs here? Because wisdom in the oldest sense means knowing how to live with water loss and uncertain beginnings. As evening approaches, the light turns gold along the low ground and the temple lines soften. The place feels less like a solved archaeological site than a patient witness. Not speaking, not revealing, just remaining. And in that stillness you begin to understand why later generations might look back toward Eridu and see not merely an old city, but the edge of a forgotten shore, a place where the world, whatever had come before it, started again with Mudreed's prayers and the stubborn decision to build. Evening slides across the lowlands in long bronze light, and with it the city begins to reveal another side of itself, less ceremonial than the temple height, less haunted than old Eridu, but no less impressive. This is the world of hands, wheels, kilns, seal stones, copper ingots, timber cargoes, bead drills, textile looms, and the small stubborn perfection of things made well enough to travel farther than their makers ever will. Most historians agree that Sumerian society depends not only on farming and temple administration, but also on highly developed craft specialization and long-distance trade. Archaeology suggests that southern Mesopotamian cities import raw materials they do not have in abundance, including timberstone and metals, while exporting finished goods, textiles, agricultural surplus, and prestige items through regional networks that stretch astonishingly far for their time. What's broadly accepted is that this world is impressively organised. Skilled artisans shape clay into standardised vessels, carve cylinder seals with astonishing detail hammer, metal twist fibres, and produce objects whose technical precision still feels uncomfortably competent. You watch a craftsperson drill a tiny bead, and the movement is so controlled, so practiced, that it briefly ruins your self-esteem. The evidence we do have points to real expertise built through training routine and accumulated knowledge. No mystery required. Just repetition, social structure, and the ancient human capacity to become extremely good at very specific things. Still, one interpretation is that remarkable precision can trigger later imagination for a reason. A careful reading might suggest that when people encounter old objects made with skill they did not expect from the distant past, they often begin to suspect lost instruction, hidden inheritance, or vanished mastery. That response is not unique to the modern age. Even ancient people may have looked at older layers, older tools, older buildings, and felt that they were inheriting techniques from a world already slipping beyond memory. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then craftsmanship itself becomes one of the quiet ways a destroyed first world can be imagined. Not because the objects prove it, because they tempt it. Historians still argue whether the sophistication of early Mesopotamian craft production is best explained through temple control, market demand, apprenticeship systems, elite patronage, or some combination of all four. A more cautious explanation could be that once dense urban life emerges, skill compounds naturally. Specialists train specialists. Workshops preserve methods. Institutions stabilise demand. Trade routes reward consistency. Precision is not mysterious if enough people spend enough time needing it. Civilization once again turns out to be powered partly by very patient people doing difficult things until everyone else starts calling it genius. You move through a workshop quarter where clay tablets dry beside finished jars, where a seal cutter leans close to stone under fading light, and where woven cloth is folded with the seriousness of treasure. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian trade networks connect the region to distant zones, including areas associated with the Persian Gulf, Iran, Anatolia, and beyond. What's broadly accepted is that Sumer does not possess all the materials it values, so exchange becomes essential. Timber comes from elsewhere, metal comes from elsewhere, hard stone comes from elsewhere. In a land of mud and reeds, luxury often has to arrive by boat or caravan, which gives imported materials a faintly magical aura before anyone even starts writing myths about them. And that aura matters. A fringe idea proposes that some Sumerian precision work, architectural planning, or technical knowledge is inherited from a much older, advanced civilization destroyed before recorded history began. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. Most historians agree that the skills visible in Mesopotamian craft and administration can be explained through human development, experimentation, institutional continuity, and trade contact over long periods. But let me rephrase that more carefully. The stronger hidden civilization claim is not supported by mainstream evidence. The weaker emotional truth is easier to understand. Exceptional craftsmanship can make the past feel deeper, wiser, and more enigmatic than we expected. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the precision itself is not a clue to lost machines or hidden masters, but to a society living close enough to failure that it cannot afford sloppiness? In a world where seals authenticate goods, where rations must be counted, where storage jars matter, where trade reputations travel, and where temples rely on steady flows of materials, competence becomes sacred in its own quiet way. One interpretation is that Sumerian precision reflects pressure. The city survives because somebody knows how to shape, tally fire, weave, carve, and transport with dependable skill. That possibility fits the broader mood of everything you have seen. Order here is not decorative, it is protective. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can recover finished objects, workshop debris, kiln remains, seal impressions, cargo traces, and distribution patterns. We cannot fully recover the feeling of inherited technique. Did artisans think of themselves as innovators, guardians of old methods, or merely workers getting through another long day under the eye of gods and administrators? Probably all three, depending on the hour. Human beings contain multitudes, especially just before dinner. You pause by a merchant, weighing goods, watching balance become trust in real time. Most historians agree that exchange in Mesopotamia involves both institutional and private actors, though the exact proportions and mechanisms remain debated. Historians still argue whether temple and palace structures dominated the economy more fully than households and merchants, or whether practical life was always messier and more flexible than formal texts suggest. That debate matters because it changes how you imagine knowledge moving, through official institutions, through family lines, through itinerant traders, through workshops attached to temples, through all of them at once like gossip with better packaging. One interpretation is that long-distance exchange may have encouraged myths of older worlds simply by exposing people to distance itself. Exotic materials arrive from beyond the horizon. Strange stones appear in local workshops. Foreign woods, metals and motifs enter daily use. The known world stretches. Once horizons stretch, imagination stretches with them. A careful reading might suggest that stories of ancient origins, divine gifts, or lost wisdom become easier to sustain in societies that routinely encounter objects whose beginnings are invisible to most citizens. If you hold a finished lapis object in a mud brick city far from its source, the world already feels layered with unseen places and unseen histories. That does not prove hidden origins. It raises the possibility that trade teaches mystery. Archaeology suggests that administrative control and material flow are tightly linked in early urban systems. The evidence we do have points to counting, sealing, labelling and storing as central practices, not peripheral ones. And here the motif returns, clay marks order, fragility. A bead must be drilled correctly. A cargo must arrive intact. A seal must match. A tablet must record. When people live inside such networks, a lost shipment can feel like a cosmic insult. A cracked jar is practically philosophy. So perhaps the old glamour of Sumerian precision comes from something beautifully ordinary, not secret inheritance from a prehistoric master culture, but relentless refinement under pressure. The first world destroyed before recorded history began may live here only as a feeling projected backward whenever later generations encounter skill they can no longer easily explain. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it has a certain elegance. We imagine lost golden ages whenever old competence embarrasses us. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. Still, as dusk deepens and workshop fires glow brighter, you begin to see why the made world of Sumer matters to tonight's puzzle. Every precise object feels like a reply to chaos. Every seal impression says this belongs here. Every carved bead says time can be disciplined. Every traded material says the horizon is not empty. And every skill passed from hand to hand says memory can survive without announcing itself. So the city's crafted things begin to shimmer around you, not as proof of a vanished superworld, but as something perhaps more moving. Little islands of precision in a floodplain civilization that knows very well how easily things are broken. And because they are made so well, because they endure, because they still carry human intention across millennia, they make the past feel not simpler but stranger, richer, and just deep enough to wonder whether some knowledge is always being rescued from the dark. Night has fully arrived now, and the city changes once more. The workshops dim. The temple height becomes a dark shape against a dark sky. Lamps burn in doorways, and the streets feel narrower as if shadow itself has joined the architecture. You keep moving because this is the hour when buried things feel closest. Not literally rising, sadly. Ancient walls do not make the effort for your convenience, but the mind becomes more willing to picture what lies underfoot. Most historians agree that many Mesopotamian sites are layered settlements, built, damaged, rebuilt, expanded, abandoned and reoccupied across long stretches of time. Archaeology suggests that what looks like one city from the surface is often a stacked record of many versions of life, each pressed into the next like damp clay taking an imprint. What's broadly accepted is that these layers form for practical reasons. Mudbrick architecture decays, floods alter terrain, floors are raised, ruins are levelled, new walls follow old foundations or ignore them entirely. People rebuild where life already has infrastructure, memory and sacred value. That part is ordinary archaeology, if anything involving thousands of years of buried human existence can be called ordinary. But one interpretation is that repeated rebuilding may also shape myth in ways people do not fully notice. A careful reading might suggest that when generations live over older walls, they no longer understand. The ground itself begins to feel like a memory device. You can sense it here. A step sinks slightly where some older void has settled. A wall line bends in a way that suggests it is honouring something beneath it. A courtyard sits a little higher than the lane beside it because earlier debris has become foundation. The evidence we do have points to cities as accumulated decisions. Not a single act of creation, but a long argument with collapse. Each generation inherits remains. Some are reused, some are ignored, some are misunderstood. Some become sacred by accident simply because everyone agrees not to move them and eventually forgets why. Historians still argue whether myths of antediluvian kings, lost beginnings and worlds before worlds are best explained through literary symbolism or through cultural memory shaped by landscapes full of ruins. There's no full consensus, and perhaps there never will be. A more cautious explanation could be that both forces matter. Stories use symbolism, yes, but symbolism often grows from lived surroundings. If you are born into a city where old walls keep appearing beneath repairs, where ancient temple platforms loom above newer neighbourhoods, and where every major building stands on prior remains, then the idea of earlier ages becomes less abstract. The past is not behind you, it is under your sandals. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the buried ruins beneath Sumerian cities do not prove a single destroyed first world, but encourage the imagination of many worlds before this one, each reduced to platform, fill, brick dust, and a few stubborn lines? That possibility does not need sensational claims to be powerful. In fact, it may be stronger without them. Most historians agree that the ancient Near East contains deep site stratigraphy precisely because people kept returning, rebuilding, and reusing important places. One interpretation is that this physical layering helps explain why Mesopotamian thought can feel comfortable with deep time repeated foundations and meaningful breaks between ages. A fringe idea proposes that some buried levels under Mesopotamian cities are remnants of a highly advanced prehistoric civilization mostly erased by catastrophe. This theory is not widely accepted and the evidence is thin. Archaeology, when done carefully, usually finds developmental continuity, environmental adaptation, and ordinary human rebuilding rather than hidden technological worlds. To be clear, this is debated mostly outside mainstream scholarship, not because archaeologists are joyless, but because dirt tends to be annoyingly specific. Still, the fringe idea keeps its grip because buried layers are inherently dramatic. People see one city on top of another and immediately want the bottom one to contain secrets instead of, say, broken jars and drainage issues. Which is unfair to broken jars. They contain plenty of secrets. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know many Mesopotamian settlements built upward through time. We know sacred and civic places were often reconstructed on older locations. We know floodplain life and mudbrick architecture encouraged constant renewal. What we cannot fully confirm is how ancient people emotionally process these buried pasts. Did they dig foundations and knowingly encounter old walls? Certainly at times. Did they attach stories to them? Probably. Did those encounters help create the sense that there had been earlier worlds, earlier orders, earlier human attempts? It's possible that they did. You pass near a building edge where the plaster has cracked, exposing brick beneath brick. Each course slightly different in colour. It looks like time-wearing stripes. Archaeology suggests that stratified sites preserve not only destruction, but continuity through adaptation. That matters. The first world destroyed before recorded history began may sound like one event in modern phrasing, but ancient landscapes rarely work that neatly. Worlds end unevenly. One quarter burns, another survives. One temple is rebuilt bigger, another disappears. One family remembers a flood, another remembers a dynasty. By the time these fragments become traditions, separate events may have fused into one emotionally convincing before. One interpretation is that myths of earlier ages are often born from this fusion. A careful reading might suggest that the idea of a lost world is what human memory produces when too many partial losses stack up. Not a fabrication exactly, more like compression. The mind makes one grand room out of many broken houses. It gives the buried layers a single mood, ancient ruin different before us. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian literature includes both historical elements and mythic structures, and archaeology suggests that real places often acquire idealized or exaggerated pasts. This raises the possibility that cities themselves teach people how to imagine prehistory. You do not need a philosopher to explain it. You need a child watching workers cut into the ground and expose old bricks. You need a priest pointing to a sacred mound and saying it has always been holy. You need a scribe copying a king list that begins in impossible antiquity. Soon enough, the city becomes a vertical story. Historians still argue whether ancient Mesopotamians thought about time in strongly linear terms, cyclical terms, or something more layered and situational. That debate matters because layered cities invite layered time. The oldest past is not gone, it remains beneath the present, supporting it, haunting it, and occasionally collapsing into it. A modern city hides its infrastructure behind pavement and steel. A mudbrick city hides history just under the floor. The difference is humbling, also dusty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. But tonight, with the lamps flickering and the earth underfoot full of buried geometry, it becomes easier to understand why Sumerian memory might lean toward worlds before worlds. Not because someone uncovered a perfect archive of a lost civilization and then misplaced it in an inconveniently dramatic way, rather because daily life unfolded on top of visible remains. The past was never fully absent. It bulged through the ground, and perhaps that is the deeper answer to tonight's question. The first world destroyed before recorded history began may not be a secret continent or a vanished empire hidden just beyond scholarship's reach. It may be the oldest layer of ordinary human life, broken, built over and felt more than known, a room under a shrine, a city beneath a city, a memory beneath a myth. So you keep walking through the night streets of Sumer, aware now that every footstep crosses not one world but many, and that the buried ruins below are not merely archaeological data, they are the quiet physical reason the ancient imagination never had to work very hard to believe in lost beginnings. Above the sleeping roofs, the sky opens clean and dark, and for the first time all evening the city seems to loosen its grip on the ground. Lamps still flicker below, dogs still patrol their tiny empires, and somewhere a late voice mutters through a wall, but your attention lifts upward. The stars over southern Mesopotamia are sharp enough to feel arranged. Most historians agree that people in ancient Mesopotamia paid close attention to the sky, especially in later periods when omen literature and systematic observation became highly developed. What's broadly accepted is that celestial signs mattered to kingship ritual timing, seasonal expectation, and the general human hobby of looking upward when the earth becomes unreliable. Archaeology suggests that sky watching in Mesopotamia grows over long stretches of time, becoming more formalized as scholarly traditions deepen. But even early on, the heavens likely feel like a realm of meaning rather than mere decoration. You stand in the warm dark and understand why. The stars do not behave like the city. They do not crumble, crack, flood, or need plaster repairs. They move with a steadiness that would feel almost rude if it were not so beautiful. One interpretation is that this contrast matters deeply. A careful reading might suggest that in a fragile, mudbrick world, the sky becomes emotionally important, not just because it governs seasons or omens, but because it seems to embody order that the earth cannot guarantee. If canals fail and walls soften, the constellations still return. The moon still waxes and thins. Dawn still arrives on schedule with the bureaucratic confidence of a temple scribe. Most historians agree that celestial observation in Mesopotamia is closely tied to political and ritual concerns. Omens matter because rulers want signs. Priests and scholars watch because timing matters. Agricultural life also depends on seasonal awareness, but historians still argue whether the deep Mesopotamian fascination with heavenly signs is best understood primarily as practical knowledge, political theology, or a more profound cultural response to uncertainty. There's no full consensus, and that matters because how you answer changes the emotional shape of the night sky. Is it a calendar, a divine message board, a source of control, a mirror for fear? Probably all of the above, which is just human beings being human again. You picture a priest or scholar on a rooftop or near a temple court watching the moon clear the horizon. He notes its appearance carefully. He notices irregularities. He stores comparisons. The evidence we do have points to a long tradition in Mesopotamia of treating the heavens as readable, though the more elaborate technical systems belong mostly to later periods. Still, even in earlier Sumerian contexts, one widely accepted truth remains: the sky is not empty. It is ordered, meaningful, and bound to earthly life. What if that order felt like a warning as much as a comfort? That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it suits the landscape. If your world is vulnerable to flood, crop failure, and political rupture, then regularity in the heavens may be reassuring while also painfully instructive. One interpretation is that celestial order gives human beings a model they wish the earth would follow. Another is that it sharpens anxiety, because when the stars look dependable and the city does not, the contrast becomes its own kind of omen. A more cautious explanation could be that sky watching grows from practical attention and later accumulates symbolic weight. But symbolic weight tends to arrive very quickly when people are already nervous. A fringe idea proposes that Sumerian sky traditions preserve literal memory of a destroyed world, perhaps one ended by celestial disaster or encoded in ancient astronomical lore. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian celestial texts reflect religious, political, and observational traditions rather than a hidden record of a prehistoric apocalypse written across the constellations. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The stronger catastrophe theory is not supported by mainstream evidence. The weaker and more interesting possibility is that repeated earthly instability made heavenly regularity feel charged with unusual significance. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know ancient Mesopotamians looked up and cared. We know later omen traditions became extraordinarily detailed. We know kings, temples, and scholars treated celestial events as meaningful. What we cannot fully confirm is how early listeners emotionally linked the sky to memories of destruction, flood, or broken order on Earth. Did the stars feel like witnesses to previous endings? Did eclipses or strange appearances stir fears that what had happened once could happen again? It's possible that they did, because human beings are not very good at separating astronomy from anxiety when something weird happens overhead. A cloud drifts past for a moment, and the stars vanish, and your chest tightens just enough to remind you how quickly meaning appears in absence. Most historians agree that Omen culture in Mesopotamia eventually connected celestial phenomena to earthly consequences in systematic ways. What's broadly accepted is not superstition in a casual sense, but a serious worldview in which heaven and earth correspond. One interpretation is that this worldview becomes more compelling in societies where earthly conditions are already precarious. If daily life teaches you that systems can fail, then anomalies in the sky are never only beautiful, they are suggestive. Historians still argue whether this tendency reflects elite control over interpretation or sincere cosmic reading rooted across society. That debate matters because if signs are controlled by specialists, the heavens become part of political order. If signs are more broadly felt, then the sky becomes a shared, emotional text. A careful reading might suggest both are true at once. Specialists formalise what everyone already senses. The moon is late. The stars look sharp. Venus is bright. Dust veils the horizon. Something must mean something. In uncertain worlds, pattern recognition becomes almost devotional. And perhaps that helps explain why stories of destroyed first worlds cling so easily to ancient skies. Not because the stars literally reveal a forgotten prehistory in direct code, but because the sky offers scale. It makes human ruin feel both tiny and somehow recorded. A city collapses. The heavens remain. A dynasty ends. The moon returns. A flood tears through fields. Orion does not take the evening off in sympathy. One interpretation is that this contrast encourages civilizations to imagine earlier catastrophes as part of a longer cosmic rhythm. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the heavens may not preserve the facts of a first destroyed world, but they may preserve the feeling that such an event belongs to a universe larger than one city's memory. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we will say so, but beneath this wide Mesopotamian sky, you can feel why the ancients kept looking upward. The stars are not just lights, they are steadiness against mudbrick impermanence. They are geometry against floodplain improvisation. They are the opposite of buried ruins, and precisely for that reason, they give buried ruins a sharper outline in the mind. So the night above Sumer becomes another kind of tablet, one not pressed by reeds, but read by weary human eyes, offering no simple proof, no final revelation. Only this soft, unsettling possibility that people who felt the ground could fail at any time naturally searched the sky for signs that the story of ruin had happened before and might happen again. And in that search, the heavens became less a map of answers than a glittering ceiling over all the lost worlds beneath their feet. Word count 1083. By the time the stars settle into familiarity and the city's last loud corners finally begin to tire themselves out, your attention drifts back down from the sky to something smaller, drier, and somehow just as powerful. A tablet in the hand, a stylus in the fingers, a line of wedges pressed into clay before the surface hardens. Most historians agree that cuneiform becomes one of the great recording systems of the ancient world, used for administration, accounting, legal matters, hymns, lexical lists, school texts, royal inscriptions, and literature. What's broadly accepted is that writing in Mesopotamia begins in practical context tied to institutions, then expands into broader cultural and intellectual life. Archaeology suggests that once a society discovers how to trap speech, memory, quantity, and ritual in durable marks, the consequences spread into nearly everything. You sit now in the dim edge of a scribal space where damp clay rests in stacked rows, and yesterday's tablets dry nearby like mute loaves of thought. Nothing here is cinematic in the glamorous sense. There are no glowing secrets humming under the floor. There is just clay, order, repetition, and the deeply unsettling realization that the people who run the world are often the ones who keep the lists straight. Civilization, as ever, is partly a victory for paperwork. And yet writing changes the emotional landscape as much as the administrative one. One interpretation is that formal writing does more than preserve information. A careful reading might suggest that it also creates a defensive wall against loss. In a place where floods can erase, rulers can fall, and buildings can soften back into earth, the act of pressing signs into clay becomes almost protective. Not because writing prevents disaster, but because it resists disappearance. The evidence we do have points to a society increasingly invested in naming, measuring, classifying, and copying. That investment may reflect confidence. It may also reflect fear of forgetting. Possibly both, because human beings do adore solving two emotional problems with one invention. Most historians agree that early writing in Mesopotamia grows out of economic administration, grain, livestock, labour rations, goods, numbers, first stories, later, or at least later, invisible form. But historians still argue whether writing should be seen mainly as a tool of control from above a practical response to complexity or a broader cultural revolution in memory. There's no full consensus, and perhaps there should not be. Writing serves authority, yes, but it also outlives authority. A tax tablet can survive the ruler who demanded it. A school exercise can outlast the school. A hymn copied badly by a tired student can reach millennia farther than the teacher ever imagined. That is a strange kind of tenderness. What if the first destroyed world survives not in dramatic revelation, but in writing's refusal to let later worlds vanish completely? That is not a claim that the tablets document a prehistoric lost civilization in any direct, sensational way. Most historians agree they do not. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The possibility is subtler. Once writing exists, it changes how people relate to the past. It sharpens the boundary between what is recorded and what is not. Everything before writing begins to feel deeper, mistier, and more vulnerable to myth. One interpretation is that cuneiform does not just preserve memory, it also throws pre-literate memory into shadow, making the age before records seem both more distant and more charged. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can read many tablets. We can date archives. We can identify genres and institutions. What we cannot recover fully is the sensation ancient people had when confronting the gap between written and unwritten past. Did the first great archives make earlier ages feel newly dark? Did scribes become more aware of unrecorded beginnings, precisely because they now possess the power to record? It's possible that they did. The moment you can write history is also the moment you realise how much happened before history became writable. You watch a student copy signs from a model tablet, his concentration wavering only slightly, as though boredom and greatness have agreed to share a bench. Most historians agree that scribal education in Mesopotamia relied on copying repetition, memorization, and lexical exercises. What's broadly accepted is that writing was learned through discipline, not inspiration. You do not sit under a palm tree waiting for genius. You copy signs until your wrist complains and your teacher remains unimpressed. One interpretation is that this culture of repetition helps preserve not only content, but form rhythm and the authority of the past itself. Copying is memory with muscle. And copying does something else. It selects. Some texts are worth preserving. Others are not. Some archives survive because they burn and harden. Others vanish because they never meet fire at the right moment, which is one of history's more ridiculous technical advantages. A more cautious explanation could be that much of what we think of as ancient memory is actually accidental survival filtered through institutional priorities. That matters tonight because it means the silence around the First World may be partly structural. The earliest losses were not all preserved because preservation itself had not yet become systematic. A fringe idea proposes that the gaps in early writing conceal direct evidence of a destroyed prehistoric civilization lost either through suppression or catastrophe. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. Most historians agree that the gaps are better explained by the late emergence of writing, uneven preservation, and the ordinary brutality of time. But if we treat the weaker version as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the feeling of a vanished First World makes emotional sense. Not because the tablets are secretly hiding it, but because they begin too late to capture everything that mattered before them. That lateness is haunting. Archaeology suggests continuity between pre-literate and literate phases in southern Mesopotamia, so the break is not absolute in lived reality. Settlements, practices, and institutions develop across time. Yet the existence of writing creates a symbolic divide. Before this, the past is mostly inferred. After this, the past can speak in first-person fragments, lists, hymns, decrees, contracts, lessons. The difference is enormous. One interpretation is that later Mesopotamian traditions with their kings before the flood, and remembered ages before ordinary time, may partly arise from living beside this divide. Writing gives shape to the present while leaving the deeper past half illuminated. Historians still argue whether the growth of writing made ancient societies feel more secure or more anxious about memory. That debate matters because security and anxiety often travel together. The more successfully you record, the more vividly you imagine what can still be lost. A careful reading might suggest that tablets are not just containers of knowledge. They are tiny fortresses against oblivion. Fragile fortresses, yes. Drop one and history becomes a pile of regrettable corners. But still, some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. Still in this scribal room with clay cooling in the night air and rows of signs catching lamp glow, it becomes easier to understand why the unwritten past would gather so much mystery. The tablets preserve enough to show that earlier worlds existed, but not enough to settle what those worlds felt like. They mark the beginning of record while quietly testifying to everything that record arrived too late to save. So the scribes press sign after sign into the surface building memory one wedge at a time, and the city sleeps around them. Beyond their walls lie ruins under houses, old floods under stories, kings under legend, and before all of it, the unwritten, dark, not empty, never empty, only waiting behind the hard edges of clay like a world that almost made it into history and then did not. The lamp burns lower now. The clayroom warm and still around you, and the signs on the tablets begin to blur slightly at the edges the way everything does when night grows deep enough. Outside, the city is quieted to the small sounds that survive exhaustion. A cough through a wall, a rope creaking, water shifting somewhere in the dark. And beneath those sounds lives the oldest question of all. Why are people here? Why were they made to labour, count, carry, repair, and begin again every morning as if the world were always half finished? Most historians agree that Mesopotamian creation traditions are not simple bedtime comfort. They are structured around work, service boundaries, and the burdens of ordered life. What's broadly accepted is that human beings in these stories often exist to maintain a cosmos that does not run itself. That is not exactly a scented candle philosophy. You sit with that for a moment. The city around you has already taught the lesson physically. Canals need clearing, grain needs measuring, roofs need patching, temples need supplying, names need recording. The evidence we do have points to labour as the pulse of Sumerian social reality, from field systems to temple households to craft production. One interpretation is that creation stories, emphasising toil, reflect this world directly. A careful reading might suggest that humans are imagined not as carefree children of paradise, but as workers brought into being because order requires maintenance. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myth frequently links divine action and human obligation. Gods establish structures, assign roles, and expect service. What's broadly accepted is that these themes belong to a society in which labour hierarchy and ritual are deeply intertwined. But historians still argue whether creation stories should be read mainly as theological explanations, political reflections of temple economies, or more expansive cultural meditations on fragility and survival. There's no full consensus, and that matters, because once you start listening carefully, these stories do not sound like the first chapter of a smooth, stable world. They sound like the operating manual for a world already under strain. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the emphasis on labour in Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian thought carries a memory not of one fully documented prehistoric cataclysm, but of a deeper human condition that life, after any collapse, feels like creation all over again? That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it fits the mood of everything you have seen. A city built from mudbrick on a floodplain never gets to pretend order is natural. Order is achieved. Order is repaired. Order is hauled in baskets and recorded in columns. One interpretation is that creation myths in this world feel so close to labour because the boundary between making a cosmos and maintaining a city is emotionally very thin. A fringe idea proposes that stories of human creation in ancient Mesopotamia conceal literal memory of a being's rebuilding society after the destruction of an earlier world. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. Most historians agree that such texts reflect religious symbolism and social reality rather than hidden technical history. But let me rephrase that more carefully. The stronger secret history reading is not supported by mainstream scholarship. The weaker reading that myth translates lived dependence on work and reconstruction into sacred language is much more plausible. And sacred language has a way of intensifying ordinary truths until they look cosmic. Archaeology suggests that labour organisation was central to early Mesopotamian institutions. Temple households' rations, seasonal work, transport, storage, textiles, building projects, all of it required people in motion. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that runs not on abstract brilliance alone, but on countless repeated tasks. One interpretation is that creation stories emphasising service may preserve this reality with unusual honesty. Human beings exist in part to keep things from falling apart. If that sounds bleak, it is also oddly intimate. The city is not held together by destiny, it is held together by someone showing up. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot know how ancient listeners felt deep in themselves when they heard that humans were made for labour. Did they feel resignation, pride, grim humour? A sense that the gods understood exactly how tiring canals are? Probably all of the above. Human reactions to cosmic duty tend to be mixed. You can believe your work matters and still wish the divine management team had hired more staff. Most historians agree that ancient myths are not sterile doctrine. They are lived stories recited in settings where people carry their own burdens into the meaning. A careful reading might suggest that creation language becomes especially powerful in societies where every generation must restore what weather, politics or water have damaged. In that context, the first world, destroyed before recorded history began, becomes less a single event than a permanent background possibility. The world can fail, therefore people must work. The gods may have structured things this way from the start, Or perhaps later people told the story that way because it matched the world they knew. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian myths preserve traces of real historical crises in softened symbolic form, or whether their power lies mostly in recurring patterns of human experience. That debate matters because both explanations can live together. Floods happen, cities rebuild, dynasties fracture, communities migrate. People then tell stories in which creation is inseparable from duty. The result is not a hidden chronicle, but something stranger. A civilization whose sacred imagination is permanently shaped by the feeling of beginning again. You step back out into the night where the air is cooler, and the streets are nearly empty. Somewhere in the distance, a worker starts before dawn, or has simply never gone to sleep, which is very relatable, if not especially soothing. The temple platform is a dark mass above the roofs. The city seems held together by habit, prayer, and inertia, which honestly describes more of human history than anyone likes to admit. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian society is highly organised. One interpretation is that organisation itself became sacred because disorganisation was never far away. And perhaps that is why labour feels so ancient here. Not merely because people worked hard, which is widely accepted, and also unavoidable, but because work was the answer to fragility. The canal must be cleared because silt does not care about your philosophical preferences. The wall must be repaired because mudbrick respects nobody. The tablet must be written because memory leaks. A more cautious explanation could be that creation myths reflect these plain realities so thoroughly that later readers mistake social truth for encoded mystery. But social truth can be mysterious enough. Why do humans endlessly rebuild? Why do they keep naming, stacking, planting and recording in places that keep undoing them? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. But tonight, under this low Mesopotamian sky, the answer feels close. Perhaps the destroyed first world is simply the one that keeps ending in small ways, generation after generation, until people no longer separate creation from repair. They tell themselves the gods made humans for work, because work is what keeps morning possible. So you walk through sleeping Sumer and feel the oldest version of civilization, not as triumph alone, but as effort sanctified. Creation here is not fireworks. It is a basket, lifted a wall, patched a line, pressed into clay, and the quiet insistence that even after loss, the world can still be made to hold together for one more day. The night has reached that deep hour when even the dogs seem less committed to their careers, and the city around you feels suspended between endurance and sleep. A few lamps still burn. A few late footsteps still cross packed earth. But most of Sumer now rests inside shadow, leaving more room for the oldest kind of speculation. The quiet kind that creeps in when facts run out and memory keeps walking. This is the hour when rumours grow elegant. Most historians agree that the surviving Sumerian and Mesopotamian texts do not plainly describe a lost advanced civilization that existed before all recorded history and was then dramatically erased. What's broadly accepted is far more modest and in its own way more interesting. The tablets preserve myths, king lists, flood traditions, hymns, administrative records, and fragments of very old cultural memory. One interpretation is that these materials can create the impression of deeper, forgotten ages without ever giving us a direct, documentary account of one vanished prehistoric superworld. That distinction matters. The evidence we do have points to mystery at the edges, not revelation in the modern clickbait sense. And yet, people keep leaning toward the edge. A popular rumour claims that the tablets describe a world before ours in clearer terms than scholars admit. A fringe idea proposes that they conceal technical knowledge, divine survivors, or memories of a civilization shattered before writing began. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. But the rumour survives because fragments are powerful. A damaged line, an impossible reign, a flood before kingship as we know it, a sacred city treated as older than memory, a god who sounds a little too practical. It does not take much for the imagination to begin dressing gaps in ceremonial robes. You feel that temptation now. The city is old enough to make almost any quiet corner feel like the mouth of an unanswered question. A wall leans where older brick has shifted beneath it. The earth rises into a mound that might be debris, might be foundation, might be the leftover shape of 5 earlier versions of somebody's certainty. The evidence we do have points to ordinary causes for most of this: rebuilding, erosion, reuse, settlement layers, mudbrick decay. All of it makes perfect archaeological sense, but one interpretation is that the physical experience of living among partial remains naturally feeds stories of prior worlds. A careful reading might suggest that the rumour of a vanished First Age does not come from nowhere. It comes from landscapes where earlier human attempts are visible but no longer legible. Historians still argue whether the fascination with lost beginnings tells us more about the ancient texts or about the people reading them later. That debate matters because every era remakes mystery in its own image. Ancient scribes may have used old kings and old floods to organise memory legitimacy and sacred time. Modern readers often bring different desires. They want hidden truth, suppressed knowledge, grand revelations, and the thrill of being among the few who really know. A more cautious explanation could be that the tablets are compelling precisely because they do not satisfy that appetite completely. They leave enough open space for speculation to perform dramatic stretching exercises. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real fascination of Sumerian tablets is not that they clearly reveal a destroyed first world, but that they preserve the human experience of not knowing where the deepest beginning went? That possibility is less flashy, but far more durable. Most historians agree that writing arrives after long stretches of unwritten human life. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamian texts already look backward toward older ages they cannot fully document. One interpretation is that this backward gaze itself becomes the source of mystery. The tablets are ancient, yes, but even they are standing late at the doorway of memory. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot confirm the exact content of stories told before writing stabilised. We cannot confirm how much of later myth dimly echoes local disasters, migrations, ruined towns, or sacred traditions already old in Sumerian times. We cannot confirm whether ancient listeners imagined one first lost world or simply many earlier ages compressed together. It's possible that the famous lost world feeling is what happens when oral memory, literary structure, and archaeological layering overlap without ever aligning neatly enough to close the case. That overlap is where rumour thrives. A popular rumour claims that scholars ignore obvious clues because the truth would be too disruptive. This is not widely accepted, and it misunderstands how frustratingly excited scholars usually are when they find anything remotely interesting. Most historians agree that if a tablet clearly described a vanished advanced civilization in unambiguous terms, specialists would spend the rest of their lives talking about little else. The stronger conspiracy version of the story is not supported by evidence. But let me rephrase that more carefully. Skepticism does not mean the mystery is fake. It means the mystery remains unsolved because the clues are partial damaged symbolic or simply too late. You pass a small shrine niche in a wall barely visible now, except for a flicker of oil light. It reminds you that ancient people did not live in a world sharply divided between the ordinary and the meaningful. The sacred hovered close to daily life. Most historians agree that myth, ritual, and administration interlocked in Mesopotamia. One interpretation is that when later readers expect a clean secret hidden inside the tablets, They impose modern storytelling habits on a world that preferred layered meaning. A text could be practical and sacred, historical and mythic, literal in one line, symbolic in the next. The ancients did not always sort their categories to make future internet debates more convenient, which feels inconsiderate but also very on brand for history. Archaeology suggests continuity across long spans of Mesopotamian development, yet the literary imagination of later texts still loves meaningful breaks before flood after flood, before kingship shifts after kingship shifts, before this city after that dynasty. The evidence we do have points to a civilization comfortable with deep pasts that are partly remembered and partly narrated into shape. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the rumour of a first destroyed world is not a mistake, so much as an exaggeration of something real. There was older loss, there were earlier layers, there were forgotten settlements, broken institutions, damaged landscapes, and stories about ages that no one could fully retrieve. Rumour simply takes that real complexity and gives it better lighting. Historians still argue whether myth preserves memory best through detail or through mood. That debate matters tonight more than ever, because the Sumerian tablets may not preserve exact details of a prehistoric destroyed world in the way some hope, but they do preserve mood with remarkable force. They preserve distance, fragility, antediluvian grandeur, reverence for old cities, anxiety about order, the sense that what came before this age was both foundational and hard to see clearly. That mood is not proof. It is suggestive, not conclusive, yet it is enough to keep the question alive. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. And here, the evidence is thin in exactly the way that makes human beings impossible to stop. A few clues, a few silences, a few broken lines, and suddenly, every generation wants to walk back into the mist and ask whether the world started twice. So the rumour remains with you as you move through the last quiet lanes of the city, not as a solved riddle, not as forbidden knowledge, but as a familiar human impulse. We find old fragments, and because they are incomplete, we give them grandeur. We feel the weight of unrecorded time, and because it cannot answer back, we imagine it as a lost age. The tablets do not close that distance, they make it visible. And perhaps that is why they continue to glow faintly and stubbornly in the dark. The dark begins to thin at its edges now, not because the mystery is ending, but because dawn is patient, and has never once asked whether you were emotionally prepared. A grey line gathers over the flat horizon. The air cools for one brief, merciful stretch, and the city seems to pause between being a dream and becoming work again. This is the hour when stories feel most honest, not because they suddenly become factual in the strictest sense, but because they loosen their grip on spectacle and reveal the shape underneath. Most historians agree that myths are not random fantasies tossed into history for decoration. What's broadly accepted is that they condense memory, ritual, fear, identity, and social order into forms people can remember and repeat. Archaeology suggests that when written and material evidence meet, myth often preserves not precise event reports, but patterns of concern that mattered over very long periods. And that is exactly where you are standing now. At the edge of a city, at the edge of writing, at the edge of a question that refuses to become either fully historical or fully imaginary. One interpretation is that Sumerian tales preserve catastrophe, not as documentary detail, but as emotional structure. A careful reading might suggest that when stories speak of floods, divine reordering, ancient kings, sacred beginnings and worlds before ordinary time, they are doing what human communities always do after uncertainty. They gather scattered experiences and turn them into something memorable enough to survive. Historians still argue whether specific Mesopotamian myths preserve real catastrophes in softened form, or whether their power lies mostly in symbolic storytelling? There's no full consensus, and maybe that is fitting. Trauma rarely enters memory in a neat chronological table. It enters as image, warning, repetition, and mood. You feel that in the city around you. Nothing here has told you one simple secret. No tablet has risen from the dust and announced with unhelpful, dramatic confidence that a single first world definitely existed, definitely fell, and definitely took the good building materials with it. Most historians agree the evidence does not support that stronger claim. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The tablets do not clearly reveal a lost prehistoric super-civilization in the way sensational retellings often promise, but the evidence we do have points to something quieter and more durable. Sumerian culture seems intensely aware of deep time, repeated instability, sacred continuity, and meaningful divides between earlier ages and the present. What if the stories are pointing at something else? What if the first world destroyed before recorded history began is not one place, but a human habit of turning layered loss into legend? That possibility is less dramatic than the more extravagant theories, but it fits the clues remarkably well. Archaeology suggests that southern Mesopotamia develops through long processes of settlement, irrigation, rebuilding, institutional growth, and environmental challenge. Cities rise and are rebuilt. Sacred sites accumulate layers. Writing emerges after long unwritten ages. Flood memory remains potent. Kingship is pushed backward into impossible antiquity. Divine stories dwell on labour order and restoration. The evidence we do have points not to one clean hidden truth, but to many kinds of remembered fragility. One interpretation is that myth becomes the vessel large enough to hold them all together. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot confirm how many local disasters lie behind one flood tradition. We cannot confirm how much early political disruption shaped stories of before and after. We cannot confirm whether ancient listeners imagined a single destroyed first world, several earlier orders, or simply a sacred before time that felt different from history. It's possible that all three ideas drifted together at different moments. Human beings are very capable of holding multiple explanations at once, especially when one is practical, one is sacred, and one sounds excellent by lamplight. A more cautious explanation could be that myth works precisely because it simplifies complexity without erasing feeling. A flood story does not need to map one event to remain true to the emotional fact of floodplain life. A king list does not need literal rain lengths to preserve the experience of a remote ancestral age. A creation story does not need to encode prehistoric engineering to reflect the reality that every ordered world depends on labour. What's broadly accepted is that ancient narratives often transform lived reality into memorable symbolic form. One interpretation is that Sumerian myth does this with unusual power because the landscape itself trains people to think in layers. You look toward the temple height now, its outline just beginning to separate from the fading dark. Below it lie houses, older walls, older floors, older memories. Somewhere beyond, canals and fields wait for daylight. Somewhere farther still, marsh and river keep their own counsel. Historians still argue whether myth is best understood as preserving history, explaining ritual, supporting power, or exploring existential uncertainty. The answer may be yes, annoyingly, to all of it. These are not separate functions in a world like this. A myth can do political work and still carry ancestral fear. It can legitimize authority and still murmur about flood. It can explain the cosmos and still be somebody's inherited memory of broken ground. That layered quality matters because it helps explain why the idea of a first destroyed world remains so compelling even when the evidence resists sharp conclusions. A fringe idea proposes that Mesopotamian myth is a scrambled record of a technologically advanced prehistoric civilization. This theory is not widely accepted and the evidence is thin. But if we treat the desire behind it as a clue rather than a conclusion, something useful appears. People sense correctly that the myths are carrying more than surface plot. They are carrying the weight of things only partly remembered. The mistake is assuming that more than surface plot must mean hidden machinery, instead of old human fear, reverence and adaptation. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we will say so. But here, with first light brushing the city and the last stars draining away, the larger pattern starts to settle. Sumerian civilization does not present itself as a people living in effortless confidence at the beginning of everything. It presents again and again as a people managing fragility. They count because things vanish. They build high because the plain is unstable. They tell flood stories because water destroys. They honour old cities because continuity is precious. They imagine ancient kings because the deepest past feels grander when detail is gone. They write because memory leaks. And that may be the real bridge between archaeology and myth. Not a secret code waiting for one brave narrator to shout it at you over ominous music, but a shared human pattern. Real instability becomes symbolic memory. Symbolic memory becomes tradition. Tradition becomes text. Text becomes puzzle. And later generations, including you, stand in the half-light, trying to decide whether the puzzle hides a lost world or simply reveals how people survive not knowing exactly what was lost. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the answer may be both. Not a lost world in the strongest literal sense, but a lost world in the sense that every civilization stands atop earlier human efforts, most of them broken, buried, softened by time, and remembered only through mood. The first destroyed world may finally be that accumulation of vanished ordinary lives pressed together until they become mythic background. So dawn reaches Sumer, slowly touching reed roofs, plaster walls and temple brick, and the city begins again. Workers stir, water is lifted, fires are coaxed awake, clay waits for new marks, and through all of it the old stories remain not solved, not disproved, not silenced, but transformed into what they may always have been, a way of remembering that before history became clear, the world had already ended and begun more than once. Now the sun begins to lift, and with it the city returns to itself so completely that you almost wonder whether the night ever happened. Workers emerge into the lanes, doors open, water jars move from hand to hand. A donkey resumes its personal campaign against dignity. Smoke rises from cook fires in thin, patient lines. Everything you have seen through the dark hours settles into daylight, and daylight, as usual, makes mystery look less theatrical and more honest. Most historians agree that Sumer stands at the beginning of recorded urban civilization in one of the clearest ways the ancient world allows. Archaeology suggests that its cities, temples' tablets, and layered ruins reflect real human development across long periods, rather than one solved supernatural riddle. What's broadly accepted is that this world is brilliant, fragile, practical, and old enough to make almost any question feel larger than itself. And still one interpretation is that the oldest tablets and traditions whisper about collapse, because collapse is part of the real story. A careful reading might suggest that when Sumerian culture looks backward, it does not see a clean beginning glowing in perfect order. It sees distance, it sees flood, it sees ancient kings beyond ordinary time, it sees sacred cities older than memory, it sees labour at the heart of life, it sees writing arrive too late to capture everything that mattered before it. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the first world, destroyed before recorded history began, is not a single hidden empire waiting to be uncovered like a stage prop. It is the deep human past itself, broken into layers, softened by water, and remembered through stories that know more about loss than they can fully say. That is a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The tablets do not prove a literal prehistoric world. in the dramatic modern sense. Most historians agree they do not. A fringe idea proposes that they preserve direct memory of a vanished advanced civilization. And while that theory is not widely accepted, its popularity tells you something important. People sense that the texts are looking across a gap. They sense that even the oldest writing belongs to a civilization already aware of older absences. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we cannot confirm is often where myth begins to glow. You walk one last time through the city in daylight, and everything now seems doubled. A courtyard is only a courtyard, and also the latest version of many courtyards before it. A temple is only a temple, and also a stack of sacred persistence raised over older ruins. A tablet is only a record, and also a small barrier built against forgetting. Most historians agree that human communities in Mesopotamia continuously rebuilt, reorganized and adapted. One interpretation is that this repeated rebuilding is the real foundation of the lost world feeling. Not one dramatic end, but many endings. Not one Atlantis, but generations of ordinary disappearance. A washed out field, a buried wall, a ruined shrine, a broken dynasty, a flood retold until it becomes the flood. Historians still argue whether ancient Mesopotamian traditions preserve specific historical events in mythic form, or whether their real power lies in expressing broad truths about instability, authority, labour and memory. There's no full consensus, and it is probably better that way. A neat answer would flatten the very thing that makes these texts endure. They are not spreadsheets of certainty. They are mixtures. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we say so. But thin evidence can still reveal thick feeling. What if the vanished first world is simply the one every civilization imagines behind itself? That question follows you now more softly than before. Not as a dare, not as a conspiracy, not as a panic. Just as a human pattern, we inherit remains. We inherit stories, we inherit silences. Then we build our present on top of them and call it a beginning. Sumer did that too. What's broadly accepted is that the people of southern Mesopotamia were innovators of writing, urban administration, religious architecture, and organised social complexity. One interpretation is that they were also heirs to older unwritten layers of human experience they could feel but not fully record. Their myths, king lists and sacred geographies may preserve the emotional outline of those layers, even where detail has vanished. A more cautious explanation could be that the title of tonight's journey is best understood poetically rather than literally. The tablets reveal not a secret map to a destroyed first world, but the enduring human awareness that history always begins in the middle of something older. Writing starts late. Cities rise over ruins. Sacred places outlive explanations. Flood stories outgrow their original banks. Memory selects, compresses and dramatizes. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that understood perhaps more clearly than many later ones that order is temporary and must be renewed. And that may be the deepest wisdom Sumer leaves behind. Not a hidden code, not forbidden machinery, not a single lost answer waiting beneath one last layer of dust. The lesson is gentler, and for that reason harder to ignore. Human worlds are always being made and unmade. The first world is destroyed again and again in little ways, then rebuilt by people who count. Grain-raised walls tell stories and press meaning into clay before the sun dries it. Most historians agree that Sumer matters because it lets us watch that process close to its recorded beginning. One interpretation is that the mystery around Sumer matters because it reminds us how much of every beginning is already recovery. So you stop at the edge of the city and look back. The temple stands above the houses. The houses stand above older foundations. The foundations stand above older earth. Somewhere in storerooms, tablets rest with their wedges fixed forever. Somewhere under the ground walls, no one remembers, continue to hold their shape in darkness. Somewhere in the stories, ancient kings still reign impossibly long floods, still divide time and sacred cities, still shine at the margin where history turns into legend. The evidence we do have points to human continuity, not fantasy certainty. Yet the silence around the evidence is meaningful too. It leaves room for wonder without asking you to abandon caution. And that balance is enough. Now the pace slows. The city softens. The light spills gently over the plain, and the roofs, the lanes, the canals, the worn steps, and the old brick all seem to rest inside the same quiet breath. You no longer need to solve the mystery. You only need to sit beside it for a little while, like a river at dawn, letting it move without forcing it into one shape. Some parts remain solid ground, some fade into interpretation, some drift into calm imagination, and all of them together make a world that feels human, ancient and tender in its fragility. So let the temple blur into the morning haze. Let the tablets cool in their shelves. Let the buried walls keep their silence. Let the old kings recede into mist, not as facts you must defend, but as figures in the long half-memory of a civilization that knew the world could break and still chose to build. The river moves. The reeds whisper. The city wakes, then softens again in the distance. And somewhere between history and dream, the first world is still ending, still beginning, still being pressed into clay by careful hands. Rest there for a moment. In the dust, in the light, in the quiet patience of old brick warming under a new sun. Nothing is asking anything more of you now. Not the flood, not the kings, not the gods. Only the hush of a very ancient morning, and the gentle thought that before memory was clear, human beings were already losing worlds and making new ones from the mud.